Thank you for those kind words, Justin, and also for Glenn earlier. And thanks to the Kaiela Institute for inviting me to deliver the 2016 oration. It was a pleasure to be with Uncle Cole Walker for such a warm welcome to country, including a chat outside. Let me start tonight by acknowledging the Yorta Yorta people, traditional custodians of land on which we gather today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and allow me to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Let me also not go over the list of dignitaries are here, but allow me to associate myself with Justin's earlier welcome. And can I say to Deborah and the choir, I was just blown away. That was fantastic. It was absolutely brilliant. To the community, to you here in this room tonight, I do not exaggerate when I say that you have done me a great honour to invite me to be with you. Like many of you, my roots are in the country. I was born in Stawell. I spent my formative years there and in Mansfield and Ballarat. Expectations for what I might do with my life were modest. I was the first person in my family to finish school. I did most of my secondary schooling at a technical school, not a high school. Yet today, I have a privileged position in our society, and I have the capacity to help make Australia a better place. Why? For the young people amongst us, for the parents amongst us, there is one answer, and that answer is education. As an economist, I care deeply about getting the economic fundamentals right, because it is the economic success of individuals that will allow us to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. But the pursuit of economic success is not something one can separate from the social and cultural dimensions of our life, something this community understands well, given the vast array of initiatives that we've heard about tonight and that we see encapsulated here in this building and in this community. I have a real sense of the Indigenous history of this region being powerful. There is, to me, a sense of a deep connection to country, a pride in Aboriginal culture and strong bonds of family. And that does not happen by chance. There must be a conscious decision to preserve that which is important. That decision to value what is important is a characteristic trademark of strong intergenerational leadership. As Noel Pearson said when he stood here in 2014, there is no other tribe in Aboriginal Australia who has produced more important leaders than the Yorta Yorta. It's evident that the legacy of men and women like William Cooper, Geraldine Briggs and Sir Doug Nicholls still influence the Yorta Yorta of 2016. These were women and men who lived the reality of dispossession and oppression, but refused to allow it to defeat them or their community. Instead, they became champions of Aboriginal rights and advocates of reconciliation with non-Indigenous Australia. It was, after all, Pastor Sir Doug Nicholls who gave a stirring sermon in Northcote when he asked his parishioners, "Why should you care about Aboriginal people?" He said, to him, firstly, as a man of the cloth, he believed in everyone being equal before God. He also believed that Aboriginal people were part of the Commonwealth of Nations. And thirdly, because, and I quote, "We want to walk with you, we don't wish to walk alone." My message to you tonight is that the Australian government cannot walk alone as it tries to shape the future of our nation. It has to work to shape it with and for all Australians, and that means communities such as this. What I want to say to Indigenous leaders more generally is that government acknowledges it has to find new ways to work with you to ensure we together are shaping a better future, one that is inclusive of Indigenous Australia. As Mick Gooder said at Garma just a few weeks ago, engagement with Indigenous people needs to improve before any long-term change can happen. That point reinforces Malcolm Turnbull's belief that we must move from a situation where policy does things to Indigenous people to a situation where policy does things with Indigenous people. Mr Turnbull's words acknowledge the fact that government policies and failures, while often well-intentioned, often have resulted in a loss of control and autonomy for Australia's Indigenous peoples. As we near the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum, which is in May next year, it's time to reflect on the self-determination that emerged from that critical vote, but also to acknowledge that the government structures that supported getting that outcome have eroded over time. Government action has too often been seen as top-down and disconnected from the aspirations of Aboriginal people and from the day-to-day realities of life in community. This disconnect all too often translates into missed opportunities. You here in the Goulburn Murray, though, have leaders that have been working to turn around this disconnect. We are determined, for our part, to respond to this leadership, to have a positive conversation with you on the future opportunities that can come from delivering on your future for your region. We recognise that it is the power to make decisions from a position of knowledge, from a position of confidence in your own responsibilities, rights and accountabilities that is critical for success. Yet in February, the Prime Minister delivered the 8th Closing the Gap report to Parliament. I have to be honest and say, when I read the draft of the Closing Gap report just after having come into this job, I was deeply disappointed. I asked myself the question, why is it that we were achieving good outcomes in some areas, but in other areas we were making no progress, or if anything, perhaps even going backwards? True, the report does give us valuable insights into where the need is greatest, what strategies have been effective, and where we can take heart from long-term gains. True also, the current Closing the Gap framework is coming on up to 10 years, and many of the targets are about to expire. What we have now is an opportunity to reset, and we should not be fearful of where we go from here, but rather attempt to seize the enormous opportunities this presents. This is our chance. Government, small g government, not either political party, but government and the Indigenous communities to take the lessons of the past decade, the successes and the failures, and work together to reset the agenda, to really, really get serious about closing the gap. If I think about my own department, which has within it Indigenous Affairs as a responsibility, a high proportion of what we fund has at best a weak evidence base on how it affects Indigenous Australians. We have to gather evidence that shows how we are improving the lives of Indigenous Australians with the policies we're pursuing. And if the policies can't deliver that evidence, then scrap the policies. Don't continue to carry on when it is clear they have failed. So we need collectively to put our minds to many questions. What did we get right over the last decade? What did we get wrong? And why? We have to use the accumulated knowledge of that last decade to try and sort out a pathway for economic development. We know that keys to self-reliance, independence and improved social outcomes are higher levels of employment, Indigenous business ownership and the opportunity to use and develop culture, knowledge and land assets to generate economic and social wealth. So how do we get there? I think it can only be achieved through partnership. Supporting the work of the Rumbalara Football and Netball Club to continue its trajectory. 20 years ago, 80% of its players were unemployed. 20% today. That is a remarkable turnaround. supporting the work of the Academy of Sport, Health and Education, or ASH as Glyn referred to it, and Melbourne University in its partnership. Supporting the work of the Algobonia Community Cabinet, acknowledging what is happening in community, involving local business, educators, and importantly supporting families and the recently launched...
The work of the Kaiela Institute...
how do we draw a greater focus
the
on the early childhood years, which can be such a driver of intergenerational change? One way is to set targets. Not everyone's a fan, but well-designed, evidence-based targets developed in partnership with communities are a powerful way of focusing government action. For a national agenda such as closing the gap, with far-reaching long-term implications for Indigenous policy, genuine engagement, partnership and collaboration with Aboriginal peoples are absolutely crucial. But that has to be built on honesty, respect and a shared responsibility and accountability. For the last 3 years, Indigenous leaders here in the Goulburn Murray region have been at the forefront of developing the Empowered Community Initiative. At its core, the EC initiative, and you know as much about this as I do, not more, is about governments backing Indigenous leaders who want to introduce positive change in their communities and regions. It's an initiative that puts Indigenous culture and participation front and centre of the decisions of government. But for it to be successful, it requires shared understanding of community aspiration and priorities, community need and current service delivery and program support. Leaders in this region have identified economic parity as the first priority, employment parity, business parity and education parity. And to an economist, that sounds like the right place to be putting the focus. I think that your leaders here are taking a true leadership role in driving priorities for this region. The employment accord between government, business and the communities that was signed last Monday is a great example of that. That accord commits to raising Indigenous employment in the region to a level proportionate to that of the local Aboriginal population. I would love to see the sorts of things that are being tried in this region actually tried elsewhere in the country. The lessons from here being shared with others. Because working together, both with government and across communities across the country, which is what the EC initiative is about, is how we will make the biggest difference. My regional office staff, and led by Rebecca Lannon, who here in the front, will work with the community to find out how best the Commonwealth can support the initiatives that you are pursuing here. In the same way, we are committed to working with community across the country. It's true, we don't get it right. It's true, it doesn't come easy. It's also true that joint setting of priorities and making decisions about service delivery and discretionary investment has inherent risks, and bureaucrats don't like risk. We have to be upfront about this, and we have to be open and honest about how things are being addressed. We have to accept from the outset that we won't always get it right. But it's far better to acknowledge that we failed, back up and try something again than stand there and belt our head against a brick wall where we're clearly not making any progress. But that means that we need to learn together as we go and together work out how we adjust what we do. It's wiser to acknowledge the fact and adjust our settings than to continue to waste our effort, to waste our motivation and to create disillusionment because we continue to pursue what we know is failing. Now, some of you know that Richard Eccles, who's one of the Deputy Secretaries in my department, is the champion in Canberra for 3 empowered community regions, the Central Coast, Inner Sydney and yours here in the Goulburn Murray. My Associate Secretary, Andrew Tongue, is the champion for the 2 Kimberley sites and Cape York. And I've personally agreed to take on this role for the NPY lands. Having senior public servants act as champions in Canberra is really indicative of the level of commitment that we are trying to create in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet through bringing all of the Indigenous affairs roles that were distributed across government into one place. It is important to us to have senior people champion the interests of the communities, because that's how we will actually be able to break down the blockages that stop Commonwealth and state cohesion, that stop cohesion within the Commonwealth, that stop cohesion between government and community. So I see our roles as helping you discuss better with government, with political government, the mutual expectations that you have for the way in which you want your role to develop. I'm going to travel to Alice Springs in the next few months to sit down with the community there and start that discussion with that group. I know full well that I am ill-equipped for that, but I am starting out on it with a sense of commitment that it is only by going and trying that we can have any chance at sitting in Canberra and making decisions from afar is a recipe for continued failure. But EC is not a government program. It's an Indigenous-led initiative. So government has to do something it finds really hard. It has to find a way of being actively involved without taking over implementation. It has to find a way to allow space for Indigenous leaders, organisations and communities to develop their own EC governance arrangements and arrangements for collaboration. For this to work, local models will need to be backed up by appropriate authority, including cultural authority, and a willingness of leaders to take responsibility. And that's clearly going to take considerable time and patience for communities and leaders themselves to get it right. And the last thing we want is government basically saying, you haven't met it on our time frame, therefore it's clearly a failure. We've got to change that whole mindset. Through Richard's engagements here, I know that this community believes additional and more effective investment in education, employment, health and social inclusion are needed to make a difference locally. I know that you're also acutely aware of the importance of building economic opportunity. Economic empowerment and participation in the real economy, either through having a job or owning a small business, is a crucial step to solving social issues. For this to happen faster, we need to find a way to rebalance the scales between welfare and economic development initiatives. At the moment, over half of what my department spends on Indigenous issues actually goes as income support or welfare. Less than a third of what we spend actually goes to economic empowerment. And yet, what are you saying to us? You're telling us that economic empowerment, economic parity, has to be the pathway forward. If we want to seriously meet the target of halving the gap in employment outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, how are we going to do this without economic empowerment? It is probably one of the most challenging of the closing of the gap targets. We are creating new jobs, but employment figures have not responded. We need to find an additional 96,500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in work by 2018 to halve the employment gap that was set 8 years ago. That is a phenomenal ask. At the same time, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are around 4 times less likely than other Australians to own their own businesses. But I come back to the fact that this community has placed a focus on employment parity and the whole idea of Indigenous business. So how do we go about it? Well, for some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, being able to choose how you use land and perhaps how you use water will be a catalyst to ending intergenerational disadvantage. For others, empowerment will require government to work in partnership with the private sector to stimulate spending and create demand for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses. Jobs are fundamental if our First Peoples are to participate in the real economy. Andrew Forrest, when he was asked to advise the government on how to improve the employment outcomes of Indigenous Australians, took a wide perspective on this and said, you can't just focus on employment because that's the outcome. You have to think about the process. Early childhood care and nurturing, education, training, welfare when there is no employment, but ultimately pathways to employment. These are the opportunities that we have to work to create with you if we are to create opportunities for Indigenous Australians to exist and flourish in the market. Through our programs at PM&C, we assist Indigenous Australians into employment opportunities, and since September 2013, 41,000 employment placements have been made. A big driver of that has been the Employment Parity Initiative, where we challenge big business to reach parity in employment. In other words, we've been trying to do at a national level what Paul and the community here has been trying to do at a community level. Partnering with some of our largest employers, we've been aiming to get an additional 20,000 Indigenous Australians into real jobs by 2020, and 11 of our biggest employers have committed to that. They include Woolworths, Accor Pacific, Compass, MSS Security, and they've already delivered 7,200 new jobs. But these companies have enormous buying power, and we want to work with them to increase their rate of purchasing from Indigenous businesses, to build strong Indigenous procurement chains through their own supply chains. In our case, we've set up an Indigenous procurement policy to drive government focus on buying from Indigenous business. Why? Well, one, because Indigenous business creation is good in and of itself, but actually Indigenous businesses are 100 times more likely to employ Indigenous people than non-Indigenous businesses are. This policy has seen contracts issued by the federal government to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses increase from the princely sum of $6 million in 2012-13. So think about it. A government that spends $400 billion a year in 2012-13 spent $6 million to buy from Indigenous businesses. On the first 11 months of operation of this new procurement target, we've issued contracts totalling $195 million. We've got to get government departments to a point where they spend 3% of their administrative budgets on Indigenous business providers by 2020. And if we can do that, that will be a phenomenally successful incentive. It's only an incentive though, because it'll get Indigenous businesses to a position where they can get a foot in the door, but after that, they have to be competitive to win the business because it has to be done on a value for money basis. But we've also tried to take another tack at it and say for people who are working with us, we want minimum Indigenous employment and supply use requirements for any contract valued at over $7.5 million. Now, in the past, we've asked our major suppliers for Indigenous participation plans, and I can assure you we did really well. We got lots of plans. Not a lot of Indigenous jobs. So we've adopted a new mandatory approach. Major suppliers can choose between an employer and a supplier use target. The targets can apply to the specific project or they can be company-wide, but they're going to be in the contract and they're going to be legally enforceable just like every other component of the contract. To date, I have to say the response from business has been both positive and pragmatic, and in fact many companies are ahead of government and are already working to include Indigenous businesses in their supply chains and have been doing so for quite some time. I think Qantas, which has done this recently, Wesfarmers, which has been doing it for a long time, and I was saying to people earlier, I went to the new Burswood Stadium that Brookfield Multiplex are building for the West Coast Eagles and the Dockers. I mean, there's 4 other things, but we know what it's really important for. And Brookfield Multiplex, working with the Wirrapunda Foundation, have actually created a pathway both for young Indigenous tradespeople to actually have work with Brookfield and with their subcontractors, because they've said to their subbies, if we can do it, why can't you do it? And when you go there now, you can actually see this great group of young Indigenous women and men who have come through the Wirrapunda Foundation training programs, who are actually in real jobs. And when the stadium's finished, they're going to have experience, they're going to have a track record, and I think their prospects look incredibly bright. We also, though, need to work with states and territories in a way that we haven't been successful at doing before. And this is really important, because state and territory governments account for over half of all spending on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We've got to find a way, as a Commonwealth government, to use our engagement with the states to try and get better outcomes. When we fund state-led infrastructure projects, we've never thought about asking the states to adopt the employer and supplier programs. Is this something that we should be doing? It's definitely something we should think about. There are a range of other things which we do with the states which we never ask the states to step forward. And by this I'm not suggesting that the states are somehow responsible for problems and the Commonwealth's not. We're both equally guilty in this space, but we've got to work together in a way that's different to what we've tried in the past if we're to change the outcomes. There are other parts of the work program that we've been pursuing that are designed to assist people get a foothold in the economy, and one of them is following on what you've been doing here, which is how do we find innovative ways to significantly increase access to home ownership and to home loans. We've set aside money for an Indigenous entrepreneurs package to try and create more opportunities for Indigenous business to be set up, startups to be innovative, and to in turn create a new pipeline of opportunities. But equally, we've said no more training for training's sake. How many of us have met young Indigenous people who have got 6 certificates but are in a position where there is no and never will be any job prospect? That is not going to be anything other than fuel for disillusionment. So we want training that leads to serious opportunity to engage in the economy. But as we all know, it's not enough for us to have programs and policies in place. We have to make them work. And while it's true that we were influenced by Andrew Forrest's recommendations, I have to say that the far greatest influence on our approach about how to implement has been what Indigenous Australians are asking of us. And that has to be the predominant theme as we go forward. It's what I was saying before, this honest and open engagement. We've got to move beyond the transactional arrangement. I was rereading an article by Michael Gordon from The Age of only last year, when he was talking about the experience of EC communities. And he pointed out in that article that in the NPY lands, to enter the agreements that the Commonwealth and the states expected of the Women's Council that's leading the EC work there, they had to have 41 separate agreements, which required something like 7,000 hours of form filling by that community. 7,000 hours that could have been used actually helping foster a stronger, more resilient community. So we've got to move from a one-size approach. We have to move to a new approach that, as I said before, has a focus on data, on evidence, on true community engagement, on flexibility, on an accountability to the public that is being affected, that is the communities. Or put it another way, we have to move to an approach where it is bureaucrats working in your world rather than the situation I just described, which is where it was a relationship characterised by applications being submitted and considered against program criteria, contracts set, funds delivered, reports provided. In other words, Indigenous people operating in the bureaucrats' world. Turning that around is absolutely essential. We need to focus more strongly, as I said, every stage on building the evidence base and evaluating our initiatives. We have to recognise that Indigenous policy is not about one size fits all. We have to be able to deal effectively with people living in remote communities with a predominant Indigenous population to communities like this where the Indigenous population comprises a relatively small share of the general community. In many of the remote communities, there's a strong focus on Indigenous specific funding to respond to social and economic issues. Whereas here, we have a thriving regional economy and the opportunity for economic parity for Aboriginal people is real. Responding to the opportunity, ensuring that everyone can share in that prosperity has to be our greatest priority, and nobody in their right mind is going to say the policies we pursue here are the same ones that we'd want to pursue at Gallawinku or at Arakoon or at Kalumbaroo. So we've all got to get better at that, and a lot of that responsibility has to rest with government. But change is needed by all parties. The community focus is certainly part of the solution, but it's not contradictory to the notion that we have national priorities. There are issues of national concern where national policy reform and national leadership is needed. Constitutional recognition is clearly one of those. Indigenous-led consultations are underway and they'll culminate in the government receiving a report and recommendations from the Referendum Council next year. But more recently, who failed to be appalled and shocked by what we saw in the Four Corners report on juvenile detention? It surely united us as a nation, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, about the need to outright reject the type of mistreatment of children that we saw in the supposed care of the state. I think Australians expected their government to move swiftly and decisively to get to the bottom of it, irrespective of which jurisdiction this occurred. To expose the failings of the youth detection and child protection system in the Northern Territory and take out lessons that can be applied around the country to ensure this never happens again. Tonight, I've spoken a lot about economic development, but let me be clear, as I said at the outset, economic development and social policy are not mutually exclusive. We need a balance, and we need to acknowledge the role of social determinants to understand what is driving outcomes. I talked about responsibility and accountability. Well, despite strong commitments by governments to improve early childhood education, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children arrive at school twice as likely to be developmentally vulnerable as non-Indigenous children. We know that regular school attendance is directly linked to a student's performance. It accounts for up to 20% of the gap in performance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous 15-year-olds. The gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids widens the longer children are in the school system. It's not the school system that's causing that gap. It's the fact that some of those kids are in the school system full-time and others are not. Let me be really blunt about these numbers because I think they go to one of the areas where accountability is a real issue. In 2015, 79% of Indigenous students in Year 3 met the minimum standard. 96% of non-Indigenous. At Year 9, the gap was 72% for Indigenous and 94% for non-Indigenous. And when we go to remote areas, it's even more stark. Efforts to increase school attendance have largely focused on very remote areas. And even now, some communities report less than 50% average attendance, with only 23% of children going to school 90% of the time. We are not going to change things unless we can get to grips with that. But even in urban schools with high overall attendance, there are children and families with poor attendance patterns. Progress has been frustrating, and yet we know that the causal factors go well beyond schooling, but we've been struggling to work out how to join up these things. And I've got to say that you have here in the cooperative a fantastic example of people working to make sure primary school children are equipped to get the full value of those early years of school. The Bush Kinder project, targeting attendance and addressing numeracy and literacy skills, is already delivering benefits, including greater engagement by parents in their children's schooling. And I just got to congratulate everybody who's involved in that, because they are the sorts of things where communities can step forward and take the lead without waiting for government. It's very clear that the payoff from investment in education is immense. And we know that the economic and social benefits are two sides of the same coin. Much of the return on investment is through better health and therefore a lighter burden on the health system. Better education for the individual and therefore less investment in remedial education by the nation as a whole. Better employment prospects for the individual, therefore less reliance on welfare and the cost of that to the nation. Reduced crime rates and fewer people in the justice system. The bottom line is, though, that all of these things equate to greater self-sufficiency and productivity, but most importantly, to happier and healthier lives. And that's surely what we're trying to get to. When Paul spoke at the National Apology Breakfast in February, he spoke of how we can no longer be passive bystanders, complicit in the crime of ambivalence and inaction. Paul, you said that the apology gave people permission to learn and seek knowledge on, and I quote, on how we construct a future. Whether it's the government, whether it's public servants like me and Rebecca and our teams here, or whether it's Indigenous leaders and members of the community, we have to look forward and clearly communicate the challenges and the opportunities of that future. We are not prisoners of a predetermined path. We can and must carve out the type of future that we want as a nation and as communities for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren. And we have to think how we get there, and more importantly, how we get there together. Thank you very much.